Ladies and gentlemen, to those of you who've been to these freedom fighters interviews before, I say welcome back. To those of you who are new, I say welcome, and I hope you will be back. The format is very much the same. We ask questions, I ask the questions, for 20 minutes, and there are no questions from the floor. And afterwards, we'll go downstairs and maybe have another drink, and we can get off to our evening functions by 7:15. So we'll kick off straight away, because our guest tonight, Lord Lawson of Blaby, former Chancellor, indeed, I think I would say you're my favourite Chancellor of all time. Now, look, you were a financial journalist before you were an MP, and even then you espoused free market positions, and you were against the post-war consensus which prevailed at the time. Were you always inclined to free markets, or was there some event, a book, a lecture, or was it your time at university? What happened?
There was a book which had just come out when I was a youngster, and it did influence me, and that was Fritz Hayek's The Road to Serfdom.
Oh, excellent. Yes, good choice.
But I think the bigger influence was the post-war Labour government. I remember the war, but there was really no politics in the war. It was all about winning the war. Afterwards, it was my first exposure to politics. And I watched very closely what the Labour government was doing. And I could see that it didn't work. It was a complete disaster.
You saw socialism in practice.
I saw socialism in practice.
Yeah, right.
And I think it was seeing socialism in practice which reinforced so strongly the views that I'd probably been germinating slowly.
Okay. You gained a PPE from Oxford. Now, there was an article in The Spectator a while back that suggested that the constant demands for essays when you're doing a PPE degree makes people short-termists. You've just got to get the research done very quickly and the essay done. And it discourages, if you like, strategic thinking. Now, you seem to have escaped that. How
Well, I have a very high regard for The Spectator, which half a century and more ago I was editor of. I think it is the best weekly in the English language by far, and it is better now than it was in my day. I think Fraser Nelson's done a really great job.
Agreed. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that every word written in it is correct.
Okay.
I think there was a tendency that way, but you say I read PPE.
Did you not?
Yes, I did. You're absolutely right. But in my day, you did all three, but you specialised in one.
Okay.
And my special subject was not economics; it was philosophy. And I think that is not a discipline that encourages short-term thinking at all.
Absolutely right. I agree with that. As a PhD in philosophy myself,
Right.
How could I agree? You worked at the Financial Times and the Sunday Telegraph in financial journalism.
Yes.
You were a city editor, weren't you, of the Sunday Telegraph?
I was the first idiot of the
there you
Sunday
go.
Telegraph, yes.
Did that impact upon your later spell at the Treasury? In other words, did it make you more aware of the needs of the city and sympathetic to them?
Well, I think the city might think that I wasn't, because you may come onto this, but I was the principal author of Big Bang, which destroyed the old city. And I enjoyed and liked the old city. It was a great place, but it was couldn't possibly compete in the modern world. So the changes that had to come.
Was there an old boy network at the city at that time?
Oh yes, there was, very much so. And it had many great and attractive qualities, but as I say, it had to change. But I think that in a curious way, if it hadn't been for the Sunday Telegraph, I would never have got into politics, because I was rung up one day by the then chairman of the Conservative Party, Oliver Poole, who you may or may not recall. And he said, will you come and see me? And so I went to see him. And he said, I enjoy what you write in the Sunday Telegraph. the Prime Minister, this was Harold Macmillan in those days, the Prime Minister's speeches are incredibly boring. They're like shopping lists. We've built so many miles of motorway, and this, that, and the other.
Could I ask which Prime Minister that was?
Harold Macmillan, I just
there you
mentioned.
go. Okay.
And he said, we've got an election coming up in a year's time. Would you...
Stand for Parliament?
No.
No.
Would you come and help him with his speeches? Because I enjoy what you write in the Sunday Telegraph, and I think you could be extremely helpful with his speeches. And as a youngster, you don't turn down lightly an invitation to help the Prime Minister of the day with his
Correct.
speeches. And he furthermore said, and after the election, if you don't want to go back to the Sunday Telegraph, I will give you a job at Lazard's. He was also chairman of Lazard's at the time. And of course, if I'd done that, I would have been much better off today than I am. Anyway, no sooner had I joined him than he resigned because of ill health, which he regretted. He thought that his doctors had let him down, and he wasn't really nearly as ill as they said. But anyhow, he did. And Alec Hume took over as successor. So I found myself for a year writing Alec Hume's speeches for him during his year as Prime Minister. And at the end of that, I'd learned one or two things. I'd learned how politics worked from the inside, right from the inside, from number 10. But I'd also learned that, which journalists are inclined to doubt, that you can have a political career and be an honest man at the same time. Because nobody had greater integrity than Alec Hume.
But let's not talk about the present day.
And
about the present day.
certainly not. And so at the end of that, I decided not to go to Lazard's, but that I would maybe go into politics on my own account, which wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Let's go back earlier than that, because you did national service. You must have been one of the last group to do national service, indeed, in the Royal Navy.
Yes.
And you became skipper of the fast patrol boat, which had the rather unfortunate name of the Gay Charger. I think these days they wouldn't name it that. So
no, well, there was a whole class of gay boats. Where the word gay did not mean
what it does now.
What it does today.
Of course not.
And no, I was extremely lucky. It was an MTB, a motor torpedo boat, and I was one of the very, very few national servicemen ever to have been given his own command.
Absolutely.
So I was extremely lucky.
Was there any incident or anecdote that you remember with some affection or maybe even amusement?
Well, there's one incident which I'll tell you about, which was slightly embarrassing, which I had just arrived back in port at the Coastal Forces base was at Lyon, the Solent, and I berthed alongside, engines off, everything. And then the person in charge said, "You're in the wrong place. You've got to move to the other side of the port." And there was a gantry between the two sides. And of course I didn't start the engines. I got my crew to haul the boat from one side to the other, which means you don't really have much control over it when it's underway. And I had forgotten that it was high tide. And so the mast hit the gantry and snapped. And this could have been very embarrassing. I don't know whether it was court-martial territory, but these masts, which have all the electronics on them, are quite expensive bits of kit. And fortunately, I made a good friend of the chief shipwright at the base. And that night, after dark, I arranged with him to swap my broken mast with a good mast, which he had, and one of the boats was having a refit there, and nobody ever discovered what had happened.
They will when this is broadcast. You might be retroactively cashiered. So. Earlier than that even, you went to school round the corner from here at Westminster.
Yes.
As did, of course, Nick Clegg and Tony Benn. Is there something about that school that leads people into politics? Maybe because it's so close to Parliament?
Well, it is close to Parliament, but I would think that really Eton is the school that leads to politics.
The school for Prime Ministers.
And I don't think that Westminster particularly did.
Well, I'm not going to praise Nick Clegg or Tony Benn, if that's what you're suggesting. Can we do some quick questions about your personal preferences? You've lived in France for some time.
Yes.
Which of its wines do you rate?
Well, of course, the best wine, without doubt, is Premier Cru claret.
Right.
But that's not in my price range, so I never drink that. There is a good local wine, though, which I'd recommend to you, which is also a red wine, the Madiran,
Right.
which is not very well known. And it has a particular flavour because it uses the Tannat grape, which is very little used in France. In fact, it's only used in Gascony, where I live, in the Basque region, and in Uruguay, because the Uruguayan wine business was started up by the Basques.
Oh, there you go.
But that is the only place in the world, and most of the French know nothing about the Tannat wine, or very little about Madiran.
What about food? Did you have any favourite French foods?
Well, I must be sort of locally patriotic. My region in France is the home, really, of foie gras de canard.
Okay.
Not foie gras d'oie. In other words, the duck foie gras, not the goose foie gras. And I think that's great.
Is it
fresh? You can't really get it anywhere else. Yeah. It has to be fresh.
Is it sourced responsibly?
I don't know what that means, but I hope it does.
What I mean is, do the animals suffer?
Well, they are force-fed, the gavage, as it's called, which is exclusively a woman's job. But they are free range, and they queue up to be fed.
Ah, well.
They all queue up to be fed. They love it so much, so it can't be too bad.
Do you have a favourite wine bar or restaurant?
There is one, if you're going to that region, there is one very good restaurant which is not too far away, I suppose 10, 15 minutes drive, which is the Florida at Castéra-Verluzon. And then there is another more ordinary restaurant, but with a very good atmosphere, very good value for money in my local market town, which is Vic-Fezensac, and that's called the Bistrot d'en face. So now you know where to eat.
Indeed, yes, okay. What's your idea of a perfect holiday?
Perfect weather, I think.
Ah, well, very good, yes. Where would you get that?
Well,
not in Scotland, I'll tell you.
No, not in Scotland. And the weather where I live now is, in general, better than the weather in England. It's not tropical weather or anything like that, but it is better than the weather we have.
A few degrees, yeah. Which part of Britain do you like best?
Oh, I like, talking about weather, I mean, I think that on a fine day, there is nothing better than the Highlands of Scotland. The trouble is they don't have many fine days.
Yeah, and there are those things they call midges at certain times of the year. Yes, okay. What type of music do you like?
Well, I suppose Mozart has to come first, but I was brought up as a child in the 30s on the great musicals of the 30s.
Busby?
No, probably proper musicals. Gershwin, Cole Porter, that kind of thing. And I have a great affection for those.
Okay. And finally, on these personal ones, have you ever had a hobby that you followed or done? Or a sport you followed?
Yeah, well, yes, I'm a very keen follower of cricket. I'm not a good cricket player. I mean, I was reasonably good at sports at school and at Oxford, but not ball games.
No,
I
okay.
don't have that hand-eye coordination, but fencing, I fenced for Westminster when it was the top fencing school in the country. I skied in the varsity race.
Okay.
If it was not a ball game, I was okay. But actually, following sport, it's ball games that I prefer, in particular cricket.
Okay. You and John Major, by the way. Yeah. Mm. Now, when you were Energy Secretary from 1981, you helped prepare for the miners' strike, and you also laid the groundwork for the later privatisation of gas and electricity. Looking back, which of those do you think was the more important?
I don't think, if I may say so, it's a very sensible question.
Thank you.
Because it is possible for more than one thing to be important. And I think they are both quite important. But if you force me to choose, I would say that preparing the country to withstand Arthur Scargill and his miners' strike
Yes.
was the more important of the two.
Yeah.
Very few people, because it was widely believed that the Heath government had lost office because of a miners' strike.
Yes.
It was widely believed, not merely in this country, but overseas.
I believed it.
We couldn't withstand a miners' strike. And so I took enormous trouble to prepare for it, and eventually Scargill lost.
Indeed.
And I think that was very important for the country.
Indeed. Now, I'm going to give you another one of those questions that you'll probably regard as a silly question, because in all of your budgets as Chancellor, you both reduced taxes and you abolished at least one tax. Which of those did you think mattered most?
Well,
Obviously both of them, yes.
Obviously both.
You're right.
But again, if I have to choose, I think that bringing down tax rates,
Yeah.
and in particular income tax rates, and at the same time balancing the budget, I think was probably the more important.
Okay. When you were presiding over the Big Bang, were there any nights before it happened when you woke up in a cold sweat thinking, is this going to work or not? Did you have a doubt that it would work?
I think in general, in government as a minister, you need to think very hard indeed before you take any big decision. But once you've taken the decision, you don't agonize over whether it's the right or the wrong decision. All the thought needs to come before you take the decision. And it was, as I indicated earlier, something that was necessary. The City of London was already very strong in the foreign exchange market. It was very strong in the commodities markets. It was very strong in the bullion market. But in the securities market, it was losing ground all the time to the United States, because under the old arrangements, no outside capital could come in.
No.
And it had to be based on the private capital of the partners of the stock exchange firms, the stockbrokers. So it was getting more and more painfully undercapitalized. And if London was going to remain the world's financial centre, the change had to come.
And you were confident and determined, right?
And yeah, I was, and I was lucky too, because of course, in a sense, it was forced on us, because as you may recall, something had to be done, because the Restrictive Practices Court, or whatever it's called in those terms, had said that the practices of the stock exchange, which, as they kept outsiders out, and all various other things, and there were fixed commissions, you couldn't compete, were anti-competitive and had to change. But I was particularly helped by the fact that I developed a close relationship with the then chairman of the stock exchange, an excellent man called Nicholas Goodison.
I remember him, yeah.
Yeah. And Nick and I were absolutely of one mind on this. So we moved forward together. And curiously enough, it was called Big Bang. And stock exchange reform has been called Big Bang through wherever in the world it's been done. And many people are not aware that the only reason why it was called Big Bang was that having decided what needed to be done, we had to decide whether to do it over a period or whether it should all be done in one day.
Like the universe.
And yeah, well, you would be aware of that. I'm not. As an atheist, I wouldn't know about that kind of thing. But Nick took the view, and I'm sure he was right, that he could get his members' approval if it were all done together on one day. But that if he had to spread it out over a period, he would lose it.
The resistance would build up.
Yes, and the question, therefore, was whether we would have the gradualist approach or the Big Bang, and we decided on the Big Bang.
Went for the Big Bang. Now, if you were to summarise in a few words the character and achievement of your Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, what might you say?
Oh, I think she was the greatest Prime Minister we've had since the war. She had the same ideas as I did on the economy, which was helpful. She had come from a slightly different way. And although our characters were totally different, our ideas were remarkably similar. We'd reached the same point. She was immensely hardworking. I think she felt, because there weren't very many women in politics in those days, that as a woman in a man's world, she had to prove herself better than any of the men. And she did a pretty good job of that.
Indeed she did. Now, after you left office, you lost an awesome 5 stones in weight, that is 70 pounds, in a matter of months. You published a best-selling diet book about it. People said you were half the man you used to be, indeed. How did you manage that? And why did you do it?
Well, I needed to do it, I think. I was aware that I was too fat. But while I was a minister, I was far too busy to really do anything about it. Once I'd left office, I thought I really must do something about it. And there were 2 reasons, actually, which led me to feel this particularly strongly, apart from the fact that I knew that I looked terrible, being so fat. That one was that I was getting pain in my knees, and my doctor said, the reason you've got this pain in your knees is that you're asking your knees to bear far too much weight. And the other thing was that I was still then a keen skier, but I found that when I fell, and if you are skiing you do fall from time to time, it was extraordinarily difficult to get up. So those 2 things together led me to go on a diet, which I devised myself.
Is it called the Lawson diet?
It's called the book. They wanted to call the book I published the Nigel Lawson diet, but I said no, that is silly. I mean, anybody can do it, but you can call it the Nigel Lawson diet book. Okay. So that's what it was called. And
what's the secret? Low carbs?
No, I'll tell you what the secret is. No, none of these gimmicky things. The secret is just to eat and drink less. It's as simple as that.
I think the starvation diet might be quite
and the psychology is that you make this as tolerable as you can by making for yourself a list, as it were, of the things you really enjoy and the things you're prepared to go without. So long as you eat less, it doesn't matter what you're eating less of. So you continue to eat the things you like best, and the things you give up, the things you don't mind giving up so much.
Like salads, yeah.
No, whatever.
Is there anything, if some young person approached you and say they were thinking of a political career, is there anything you might say to them?
I think I would say to them, do something else first. I think it's changing now for the better. One of the few things in politics that is changing for the better. But I think that we went through a phase in which far too many people went into politics having done nothing else.
Yeah. Special advisors.
Special advisors, research assistants, whatever. And I think it is very important that our politicians should have experience of the real world before they go into politics.
Okay, final question. We're coming up for time. You've tried to inject some realism into the global warming debate since you left Parliament, since you left the Commons. I'm sorry. How successful do you think you've been so far?
One is never as successful as one would like to be, but I wrote this book about it, which became a bestseller. Interestingly, the prejudice was so great that no British publisher would touch it, and I have it published by an American publisher. And the British publisher said there's no market for this, and of course the book became a bestseller, which proved that it was pure prejudice on their part. They thought that they would no longer be invited to dinner parties if they had published a book as subversive as that. Anyhow, it was a bestseller, and on the back of that, a number of people came to me and said, look, this is so good, you must write another book. And I said, no, I've written the book, but I agreed that I should follow it up. So I founded this think tank, and I knew exactly who I wanted to run it. And this was 10 years ago. A very good man called Benny Pizer, and he is still running it today. And I had the funding from people who liked the book, and it's taken off, and it's going strong. And we undoubtedly had an influence. I would like us to have even more influence, but it's very difficult now. When you get institutions like the BBC, which is not a wholly unimportant institution, and which refuses, as a matter of policy, and it's there in black and white, to allow any dissenter from this green orthodoxy to take part in any of their programs. So we continue the struggle, but as I say, I have a brilliant director and a very good board of trustees, and I've now just bowed out because I think 10 years is long enough.
Okay. I'm going to close it there, but I want you to thank Lord Lawson. And I would make the final comment that Parliament these days MPs don't stand in all that high popular esteem. And you've shown us tonight how it used to be different, and I'd like to thank you for that. So.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, and thank you all for sitting